Hello again, everybody. We are going to move on to the next phase of processing our data, where we're going to start recoding some of our knowledge, attitudes, and practices variables as zeros or ones to reflect whether or not a given response should contribute to a participant's knowledge, attitude, or practice score. Now, we already talked about this a bit when we were doing our correlation and regression applied case study in lecture, but just as a general reminder, one of the things that we talked about in dealing with knowledge, attitudes, and practices data is that we have to take these responses, which you can see, for example, here, which of these symptoms are ones that you would associate with Lyme disease, where we have all of these potential different responses that participants could respond with, and we have to convert that from series of words into usable, analyzable data that's reflective of somebody's sum total knowledge or attitudes or practices with regard to a given disease. So we said that there are a couple steps in that process, and one of them was recoding all of the respondents' answers to each question as reflecting correct knowledge, positive attitudes, or beneficial practices. So what we're going to do in this video, in this portion of our data analysis process, is talk about how we go about doing that conversion from word answers regarding knowledge, attitudes, and practices into numeric values that are reflective of somebody's knowledge, attitudes, or practices with regard to a disease. Now, just to reorient us to our data, these first variables that I've got here are our socio-demographic variables, or variables with specific answers about willingness to receive a vaccine. Again, all of this data processing was in reference to those imaginary research questions that I gave you all in our previous videos in this series. And if you don't quite remember what I'm talking about, just go ahead and head back to those videos, because obviously the data set that you all will be working with will have different variables, and this is certainly not reflective of the sum total data set that you all have been provided with. I also, in previous videos, identified the different knowledge, attitudes, and practices questions that were relevant to my research questions. So now what I'm going to do is talk you all through how we actually go about doing that sort of data processing. So the first thing that I'm going to do to help myself keep track of my thoughts is copy and paste over all of the questions and answer options to each of the relevant knowledge, attitudes, or practices questions that I identified in our previous video. So all I've done is highlight all of those, and then I'll just go ahead and do the click version of this, and I'm going to copy it. Now, to help me keep track of things, I'm going to use another sheet over here where I can do my work. And now all I'm going to do is paste in those questions. Actually, I'm going to do that in a different way because I want to maintain formatting here. So I am just going to paste in exactly as they were before so that I can keep those question groups highlighted in different colors. Now, what we're going to do in this portion is describe which code each potential response should get. So I'm going to make my column header in my first column code. And then I'm going to specify which responses should get a 0 and which responses should get a 1. Now, as we said in class, a coding of 1 regarding knowledge reflects that that individual has correct knowledge regarding some element of the disease. For knowledge, a coding of 0 reflects a lack of knowledge or incorrect knowledge. So in this case, since we're talking about Lyme-based knowledge, what we have to do is identify which responses, selected or not selected, reflect correct answers, correct knowledge regarding the symptoms of Lyme disease. Now, in this case, our first question there, which of these symptoms are ones that you would associate with Lyme disease, that's our overarching question. But since the responses to those questions have been broken down into these individual columns, we can at this point just delete that. So what I'm going to do is highlight that column, and I'm going to click delete. I no longer need it. So now what I have to do is reflect on the knowledge that I already have about Lyme disease, which hopefully all of you also have about your focal diseases, to reflect which of these are or are not symptoms of Lyme disease. Okay, so for the first one, for rashes, for example, I know that rashes are a symptom of Lyme disease. So the response that participants could say that would be coded for as a 1, correct response, would be if The data sheet that we have over here in sheet 1 reflected that they did select that rashes are a symptom of Lyme disease. Now, we can also see here that quite a few participants did not select that rashes are a symptom of Lyme disease. So we're going to go ahead and code not selected as a 0 knowledge score for that Lyme disease symptom. Rashes are a symptom of Lyme disease. That classic bullseye shape is a typical symptom of Lyme disease. So if participants did not select it, that reflects a lack of correct knowledge. Now, all you have to do at this point is go through all of these other symptoms, correctly assigning participant responses with whether they are reflective of accurate knowledge or not. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that real quick, and I'll actually do that by showing you all a handy dandy trick here. If you go across all these Lyme disease symptoms, it turns out that they are all symptoms of Lyme disease minus coughing. So rather than having to type selected a whole bunch of times or copy and paste a whole bunch of times, what I can do is just hover my mouse over that little green square in the bottom right-hand corner of the box there, and now it brought up a little black plus sign. If I just pull that over as far as I want it to go, so I don't want it to go to coughing, it copies over all of those entries. So now I've reflected in this record that selected is the response for each of these Lyme disease symptoms that should contribute as a positive factor in a participant's knowledge score. I can do the exact same thing to copy over not selected. So all I do is take my cursor that I'm wiggling here, hold it over that little green square in the bottom right-hand corner, and now I just drag it over as far as I want. Boom. So now I've got all of that pulled off. Okay. Now for coughing, we said that coughing is not reflective of Lyme disease. So what we want to do is go ahead and reflect that if somebody did not select coughing as a Lyme disease symptom, that is correct. If somebody did select coughing as a Lyme disease symptom, that is not correct. So, and I'm just going to go ahead over here, it's easier to keep track of our zeros and ones, just because you'll notice that when we get over here, right, we want to make sure that we're putting the correct item selected or not selected with that 0 and 1. To make it a little bit easier to make sure we're aligning things properly, what we're going to do is freeze this first column. So all you have to do that is go over to the View tab in your Excel, and then you're going to go over to Freeze Panes. When we click on Freeze Panes, I'm going to tell it I want to freeze the first column. All that's going to do is that when I scroll over, it's going to keep that first column stable, so I can always make sure that the values that I'm providing for each of these answer options are consistent with what I want. So since coughing is not a symptom of Lyme disease, the selected option should reflect a 0 score and not selected should reflect 1. Now, the next thing that we have to deal with are these two other answer options here. So Lyme disease symptoms unaware of any Lyme disease symptom, or Lyme disease symptom prefer not to answer. So what we have to ask ourselves is, do individuals' responses to those questions meaningfully contribute to their total Lyme disease knowledge score? Now, this is a really interesting conversation because you could say, all right, well, if someone is unaware of any Lyme disease symptoms, then that should get them a 0. And if somebody says that if somebody doesn't respond that they're unaware, that should give them a +1 because they're saying they do know something. However, when we think about the responses to all of the other columns that we have for Lyme disease symptoms, that answer is already captured in their 0 or 1 responses that we'll have coded them for. If they're unaware of any Lyme disease symptoms, then they would have already not selected any of them, and so that would be reflected in the scores that they got. If they are aware of Lyme disease symptoms, well, they've already selected those. So if we were to assign unaware to either a 0 or a 1, we might be essentially duplicating information that we've already created from our other columns. Same thing with prefer not to answer. Somebody's preference to not answer doesn't tell us anything about their knowledge. So my decision for that would be to simply get rid of those columns, as prefer not to answer gives me absolutely no meaningful information about their knowledge, and unaware of Lyme disease symptoms should already generally be captured in the previous responses to those specific symptom columns. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that out because I no longer need it. Okay. So now we do the exact same thing for our next element of knowledge. How is Lyme disease transmitted from one person to another? Now, again, we've broken out all possible options here into individual columns, so we don't need to keep this overarching question column. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that one again. And then we do the exact same thing. Now, the only way that we can get Lyme disease is over here with tick bites. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put selected there as contributing positively to someone's Lyme disease knowledge score and not selected for 0. All the other ones are options that cannot transmit Lyme disease. So you can't get it directly person to person, we can't get airborne, etc. So to reflect positive Lyme disease, that would indicate the not selected option. So if someone has correctly said, for example, you cannot get Lyme disease via airborne transmission, that reflects correct knowledge. So not selected is going to be our one coding for this element of Lyme disease. All right, so I've got not selected for all of those. So now I'm going to put selected as reflecting incorrect knowledge about Lyme disease transmission for all of those others. Okay. Now, this one is another interesting one. Lyme transmission. Transmission from person to person is not possible. Of course, that is correct. So again, selected in this case would reflect positive knowledge, and not selected would reflect incorrect knowledge. Similar to our last discussion here with Lyme disease transmission, I don't know doesn't provide us with any additional information that we haven't already captured from our other columns, so we're going to go ahead and delete that. Okay, so that brings us to our last knowledge, attitudes, or practices column that we've identified as being relevant for this specific study, which is a practices-based question. Which of the following actions, if any, do you currently take to prevent mosquito bites? Select all that apply. Now, remember when we're talking about practices score, generally the way that coding works there is that if an individual does a positive practice, in other words, a practice that would reduce their probability of encountering the vector or getting the vector-borne disease itself, that contributes positively toward a practices score. If they don't do a given practice, then that contributes as a 0. So just like what we did before, we're going to delete this overarching question because it's already captured in our individual columns, and then we're going to code things as selected or not selected regarding positive practices. Now, if we look at all of these options, using insect repellent, wearing covering clothing, emptying standing water, and ensuring that you've got good screens on your windows and doors, all of those are positive practices. So we're going to code selected for all of these options as 1 and contributing to somebody's practices score. If an answer was not selected, that does not indicate a positive practice being done, so that's going to get a 0 coding. Just like in our previous questions, none of the above doesn't tell us anything that our previous columns haven't already captured, so we're going to go ahead and delete that. Now, in this case, with the example questions that we're working with, we only did knowledge questions and practices questions. But remember, we already covered attitude scoring as well in our previous lecture. But just a reminder, generally when we're talking about scoring attitudes, an attitude that reflects a positive perception of the ability to control vectors or disease contributes to a positive attitude score, so a +1, or an attitude that's consistent with reality also contributes positively to an attitude score. So if somebody is consistent in their perception of the relative risk of a disease, and that is reflected in an attitudes question, that would also contribute positively toward that person's attitude score. Okay. So at this point, we figured out all of the coding for our various disease options. And now what we have to do is think about how we can actually apply that coding to the data that we have in our full data sets. Now, keeping track of all of the decisions that you've made in your data processing is really critical because it's very easy once you've converted all of this data into zeros and ones to lose track of what those zeros and ones mean. So we're going to make sure that we maintain this coding guide in our paperwork trail, essentially, of recoding our data. So in keeping with that idea of giving ourselves a paper trail of our decision making, the next thing that we're going to do is take that full data set that we have over here from sheet 1, and we're going to copy and paste it over into another sheet to work on our recoding. And again, the reason for doing that is exactly why I recommended that you save this abridged data set as a separate file from the original one. We want to give ourselves multiple places in time that we can return to in case we make a mistake, so that we don't have to go all the way back to the beginning and start from scratch. Okay, so all I'm going to do here is go ahead and select all. So let me go ahead and do a little Control A situation to select all. And now I'm just going to copy right there. And I'm going to go over to sheet 3 and I'm going to paste that in. Okay. And I'm actually going to paste it somewhat prettier than that actually because that looked ugly. So I'm going to maintain formatting here. Oh, it didn't quite maintain my formatting after all. Oh well, I can get that fixed real quick. So we're just going to go ahead and highlight that to make our columns look prettier again. There we go. And now to keep track of things, I'm going to rename my sheets. Original, original without recoding. There's that one. Okay, now I'm going to rename this one coding key. And now I'm going to rename this one, rename with recoding. Okay, and that's just going to help me keep track of what I'm doing in these different files. All right, so at this point, we don't have to touch any of these columns. We're leaving them alone because we're not trying to rekey them. What we do have to touch are these columns over here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give us some tips on how to do that. First off, I recommend that for now, you keep these total answer columns because as we rekey things, we want to make sure that they're consistent with our original answers. So what we're going to do is do a little bit of reordering of our columns to make our lives easier. So when we look over at our coding key, we can see that the only answer options that had not selected as correct is coughing. So what we're going to do is reorganize our columns if needed to reflect that that indicates a lack of Lyme disease knowledge. So let's make sure we've got rashes and all of those options. And okay, coughing is over here where it is the only one where not selected is correct. Now we did say that we're not getting any information out of these unaware of Lyme disease symptoms and prefer not to answer. So we are going to go ahead and delete those. All right. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and insert a column between Lyme symptom coughing and Lyme symptom sore throat. And the only reason that I'm doing that is to help myself keep track of which answer options have selected versus not as being recoded as 0 or 1. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this is going to be a real pain to go ahead and recode selected or not selected, but we're going to talk about a handy dandy trick to make it not such a pain in the butt. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce my font size just a little bit here so I can get all of my not selecteds in there, or excuse me, all of my symptoms in there. And now all I'm going to do is go ahead and drag my mouse over through all of the symptoms where selected reflects a correct knowledge score. And I'm just going to go ahead and highlight all of those. So what I've done at this point is highlighted all of the ones where not selected should get a 0 and selected should get a 1. Okay, so I've got all those highlighted and now all I'm going to do is hit Control H, which just pulls up my find and replace option. Okay, window, so let me fix that. It'll pull up something that looks like this, where it'll say, what do you want to find and what do you want to replace it with? If you go over to options by clicking on that little button right there, so right here, it's going to pull up a little bit of a bigger set of settings that you can have. So what I want to do is just tell it what I want it to find in that highlighted area and what I want to replace it with. And critically, you'll see that I'm going to select match entire cell contents. So, because I want selected to be recoded with 1, because selecting all of these different symptoms I've got highlighted reflects positive knowledge, I would type in just selected and replace with, and I've already got it in there, 1. Match entire cell contents. Now, I'm going to go down to the bottom left here and hit replace all. And voila, just like that, every single place where it said selected now says 1. Now I do the exact same thing for my not selected, where I type in not and say if they didn't select it, that should get a 0. Now I do the same thing and I say replace all. And voila, just like that, I've got all of my recoding done. Okay, so nice and easy peasy. Now, there's also another way that we could go about doing this as well if you want to take it a little bit more step by step. So what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and delete that column that I just showed you so that all of my columns are continuous. Another way, if I didn't want to do it all at once, that I could go ahead and let's say recode my coughing symptoms, is I could do a sort by. So all I have to do to sort by is go over to data in my data column there, and then click this sort button. What that's going to pull up is an option for me to tell it how I want to sort things. You'll notice that I've got checked off here that my data has headers, and that's just giving it options for how it wants to think about sorting my columns. So I'm going to tell it I want to sort by column, and I'm going to go ahead and sort by Lyme symptom coughing. And it's just going to give me the option of how I want to sort. A to Z makes sense, no problem with that. So I'm going to tell it OK. And what that's done is reorganize my whole data set so that all of the answers are aligned based on whether or not somebody picked it not selected for coughing, or if we scroll down, selected. Now at that point, if I want to just do this recoding by hand, all I have to do is insert a column there, and I can copy over that Lyme disease symptoms coughing, and everywhere somebody said not selected, I can tell it that I want that to be 1, because coughing is not a symptom of Lyme disease, so not selected should receive a positive answer option. And then all I do is drag that 1 all the way down. Same thing with selected. If I want selected to equal 0 in this case, all I do is drag that all the way down, and I've now successfully recoded all of my Lyme disease symptom coughing. And I can delete that uncoded variable. Okay. So at this point, we've got this general process down for how we can think about recoding these. So I'm going to go ahead and do that same recoding work here. I'll pause my video so that you don't have to watch me do it all over again. And then I'll come back together to show you the next step of the process where we make participants' net knowledge and practices scores. All right, so I'm going to go ahead really quickly and just pause recording so you don't have to watch me do this a million times, and then we'll come back together to make those net knowledge, attitudes, and practices scores. Okay, so I went ahead and recoded all of our knowledge and practices variables here, and you can just see that that's with the exact same process we talked about before, and all of that is directly reflective of the way we describe those variables in our coding key based on whether it reflects accurate knowledge or preventative practices. So now the next thing that we have to do then is think about creating participants' sum total knowledge score and sum total practices score. Now, we already said that the only variable that we've got here, or the only question I should say, that's reflective of practices is this ending question there, where it's which of the following actions, if any, do you currently take to prevent mosquito bites? Okay, we said that all of these options should contribute to somebody's practices score. So over here, what I'm going to do to create this practices score is write practices score. Okay, cool. And all I have to do to create that practices score, just like we talked about in lecture, is sum up all of a participant's codes as either zeros or ones to reflect their final total beneficial practices. Now that's super easy to do here in Excel. All you have to do is type equals sum parentheses, and then with your mouse, just go ahead and highlight everything that you want to be summed, end parentheses, hit enter. This person did only one positive practice, so their practices score would be a 1 out of 4. All we have to do to apply that exact same process to everybody else is use that same mouse trick I showed you earlier, where all we have to do is take our mouse that I'm wiggling here, hover it over that little green box, and in this case, double click, and voila. We've got everybody's practices score from 0, meaning that they didn't do any preventative practices, all the way up to 4, where they report doing all of those preventative practices. Okay, so one of the things that I do want to mention that I always recommend doing, right now these practices scores are generated by this formula summing things up. But that means if I were to copy and paste these, then that formula would also copy and paste to be reflective of the new cells that I've put those values in. Whoops. And so what we want to do then is make sure that we can maintain these practices scores unchanging. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and highlight this whole column, And then I'm going to copy it. So here I go, copy. And I'm going to paste it right here, but the type of pasting I'm going to do is this special one here where it says paste values. What that's going to do is take those values that are in our first column, AD, saved as a formula, and only maintain the numeric values. So now I can copy and paste that freely with no problems. So now that I've got that taken care of, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this equation-based column so that I can make sure I keep those values maintained. And I am going to go ahead and highlight that to make sure that it stays with my other practices, just because I like to keep things uniform. Okay, so now we've got our summed practices score for all of our participants with a minimum of 0 and maximum possible practices score of 4. What we now need to do then is figure out our knowledge score. We identified two different question sets as pertaining to somebody's knowledge, and that would be knowledge about symptoms as well as knowledge about transmission. So what we need to do now then is sum up all of the possible zeros and ones to reflect somebody's knowledge about those two different elements of Lyme disease. Okay, so all we have to do to get this taken care of is the exact same process that we used for our practices question. Now, in this case, I am going to go ahead and delete this how is Lyme disease transmitted column because it's in the way of our summation and we don't really need it anymore. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click on this column and insert a column. And I'm going to use this as my knowledge score column. Now, this process again is exactly the same. All we're doing is tallying up all of these different options that reflected either good knowledge or incorrect knowledge of Lyme disease. Okay, so let's go ahead and get that entered in where we're going to say equals sum parentheses. And then we're going to highlight all of these options here that reflected a participant did have good knowledge. And we're just going to end parentheses there and hit enter. Okay, so just like we did before, all we have to do to pull this down for our entire column is hover our mouse over that little green square and click. Okay, so at this point, what we've got is all of our participants' sum total knowledge scores, and it looks like nobody bottomed out at 0 in this one, so everybody had at least some positive knowledge. But we can also see what our maximum would be to see if anybody met that maximum. So I'm just going to highlight all of the columns that could pertain to it to figure out what our max is. So it looks like we had a maximum score of 17. Let's see if anybody got that max score of 17. Let's see, just scrolling through. Nope, it looks like, oh, somebody came really close. It looks like we topped out at 16, so still pretty darn high knowledge of Lyme disease. Okay, so now what we're going to do is the same thing we did before, where we're going to make sure that we can maintain those numeric values without change. So I'm just going to highlight that column, copy it real quick, and then paste that in over here using that special paste values only option. Okay, and so at this point, what I've now done, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that sum-based one, is I have a column for every single one of our, I think we said 90 some participants that reflects their knowledge of Lyme disease and their practices with regard to mosquitoes. So now I've got that value for every single individual participant. Okay. Now, one thing that I would recommend doing is maintaining each of these individual columns as well, as it might be particularly interesting. So maybe you're really interested in knowing whether or not, let's say, knowledge of parents is associated with knowledge about rashes as a Lyme disease symptom in particular, or you want to know the specific proportion of respondents who specifically know that rashes are a symptom of Lyme disease. At that point, you can get that information pretty darn easily if you maintain these individual columns. So if you're at all interested in analyzing a particular symptom or a particular element of knowledge or practice or attitudes, it's recommendable to maintain those individual columns. But what we're going to focus on now then is how we can think about also using those knowledge and practices scores to generate high versus low knowledge categories or high versus low practices categories. So we said for knowledge, the maximum possible value you could have for a knowledge score was 17. So that means our knowledge spectrum ranges from 0, which is no positive knowledge about Lyme disease at all, up to 17, which would reflect a participant answering every single question correctly. So, what we want to think about in our high versus low knowledge categories is the way that we would break down those potential scores as reflecting somebody as being in a generally low knowledge grouping or a generally high knowledge grouping. Now, the example that we worked on in class, they basically split it in half, where if a participant answered half or more of the questions correctly, they were considered being in a high knowledge grouping. Now, obviously, 17 is an odd number, so we could break it down really either way and say that answering 8 questions correctly or more would be reflective, of that high knowledge grouping, or answering 9 questions or more would be reflective of that high knowledge grouping. The specifics there don't really matter which way you decide to cut off your rounding. What's more important is that you describe your decision-making process and generally are reflective of what would be a reasonable cutoff for high versus low knowledge. Now, the way that we can easily develop those high versus low knowledge categories in Excel is just to use that sorting function that I showed you all earlier. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and insert another column. So I'm just going to right click here and say insert, and I'm going to call this knowledge categories. Categories, okay. And what I'm going to say is that any score that gets a 9 or above reflects high knowledge. Any score that is 8 or below reflects low knowledge. Now, what I have to do then is just sort this data such that it's organized now based on my knowledge score, and then I can very easily assign everybody at 8 or lower to low knowledge and anybody at 9 or higher to high knowledge. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and go over to that data tab here, click on that data tab, and then click sort. And I'm going to say that I want to sort based on knowledge score. So I'm just going to scroll down there and get knowledge score. And it recognizes that those are numbers, so it's going to say, okay, fine, I'll sort from smallest to largest. And I say, okay. And now all I have to do is say, all right, I've got 2 here. That's reflective of low knowledge. So I'm just going to drag that low knowledge designator until I hit my first 9s. And boom, just like that, I've got everybody at 8 or lower categorized as low knowledge. Everybody at 9 or higher is going to get high knowledge. And so all I have to do is fill in all of those high knowledge individuals. And now I've got everybody appropriately classified relative to their knowledge of Lyme disease. I can do the exact same over here for their practices. So I'm going to go ahead and put practices category over here. Oops, there we go. And I'm going to do the exact same process here where I'm going to go back to that sort button, but instead of sorting based on knowledge score, I'm going to sort based on practices score. I hit OK. And once again, all I have to do is make that decision, where in this case, I'm going to say 0 through 2, since we max out at 4, reflects low practices. So poor practices, or you know what, let's call it poor. Poor, because I want to differentiate the words I'm using between these options. And so we're just going to drag that down to all of our 2s. Here we go, reflective of poor practices. And then we'll say anything 3 or higher is reflective of good practices. And so now we've got all of our 3s and 4s in that good practices category. Okay, and just like that, we've now recoded all of our variables as 0s or 1s so that we could generate a numeric knowledge score and a numeric practices score. We didn't handle attitudes in this video, but it would have worked the exact same way. And then we've described designating people based on their scores into different categories of knowledge, low or high, and practices, poor or good. Now, of course, we could still say low or high practices or low or high attitude. The wording doesn't matter. All we're doing is grouping people off according to their average score. Okay, so that finishes up our recoding portion of this video. And what we're going to do next then is talk a little bit about getting your data in a format that's ready to be imported into R. Okay, so I will see you all shortly in that next video. Have a good one, everybody.